I never imagined that an ordinary business trip could unravel the life I'd so carefully built. For years, I'd prided myself on being a dedicated husband and a hard-working professional. My name is Mark Harrison, and until recently, everything seemed predictable. I traveled often. Client meetings, conferences, and countless late-night flights had become my norm. Meanwhile, home was my safe haven, a place where I trusted every routine detail to be just as it should be. My wife, Laura, managed our home with a mix of independence and charm. We'd met in college, fallen in love in a way that felt as natural as breathing. Laura always had a knack for handling things on her own, a trait I admired and occasionally envied. But life has its secrets, and often, they hide in plain sight. I'd settled into one of those typical busy cycles. A week of back-to-back meetings followed by a weekend of fleeting phone calls with Laura. At the time, I believed our marriage was steady, even if the distance sometimes made things feel a little unaccountable. I'd even joked with colleagues about how lucky I was to have a partner who was so independent. Little did I know that independence, when left unchecked, could harbor a dangerous edge. The first hint came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was checking messages in my hotel room after a long day of negotiations when I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. On the other end, an elderly voice, gruff yet measured, introduced himself as Jack. He explained that he lived right across the street from my house and, after years of observing the neighborhood, felt compelled to reach out. At first, I dismissed his words as those of a cantankerous old man with too much time on his hands. Jack claimed that he'd seen something out of the ordinary, something that made him worry about my family. "I'm a retired cop," he said slowly, emphasizing each word as if it carried the weight of a verdict. "I've seen plenty in my years, and what I witnessed might not be what you'd expect." His tone was more matter-of-fact than accusing, and for a moment, I hesitated. The combination of his age, his past, and the mystery in his voice planted a seed of doubt. I decided to keep the conversation brief, nodding in polite disbelief over the phone. After all, a retired cop wouldn't typically meddle in someone else's personal life, or so I thought. I thanked him for his concern, assured him that I would look into it, and ended the call. The conversation left me with more questions than answers, and I brushed it off as an odd interaction with a nosy neighbor. The following day, as I navigated the busy airport, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a slight unease in the back of my mind that I tried to dismiss as the natural anxiety of being away from home for too long. I spent the day in meetings, making deals and signing contracts, while that lingering voice of caution from Jack faded into the background, at least for a while. As the days passed, routine prevailed. Laura would call sporadically, and her voice, though warm, carried an unfamiliar hint of evasiveness. I attributed it to the stress of managing things at home, especially when I wasn't there. After all, a busy life sometimes leaves little room for extra details. My focus was on the work at hand, and I assumed that any concerns would naturally resolve themselves with time. Back at home, I remained blissfully unaware of the nightly comings and goings that would soon upend my understanding of trust. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Laura would grab her purse and step out. She always mentioned meeting a friend or attending a charity dinner. Those were the stories, the well-practiced lines that reassured me of her independence and social nature. I never doubted her intentions, until Jack's next call. A week after our brief conversation, I received another call from him. "Mark," Jack said in that same measured tone, "I've been watching over your place while you're away. There's something you need to see." His words were blunt, leaving no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't idle gossip or the ramblings of an old man. It was a promise of evidence. He mentioned that he would gather proof of whatever it was he'd noticed, and that I should trust him enough to wait for the details. I felt a mixture of disbelief and skepticism. The notion that my wife might be involved in something nefarious seemed absurd. I wondered if I was being set up for an elaborate misunderstanding. Yet Jack's insistence, and the precise, unemotional way he spoke, began to chip away at my certainty. It was as if he knew exactly how to deliver a blow without the theatrics of a bad detective novel. I spent the remainder of my business week in a haze of conflicting thoughts. Every time I recalled Laura's casual tone during our calls or her vague explanations for her late departures, a small part of me wondered if there might be a grain of truth in Jack's words. But I chose to believe in the life we'd built together, dismissing the possibility that my dear Laura could ever betray that trust. As the week drew to a close and I prepared for my return, I couldn't help but feel that the air around me was charged with an unspoken tension. The flight back home was filled with the usual exhaustion of travel, yet my mind raced with thoughts of what Jack might have discovered. I wondered if I was ready to face a truth I'd long denied, a truth that might shatter the illusion of our perfect routine. The real twist, however, was yet to come. Unbeknownst to me, while I was embroiled in corporate deals and airport lounges, a meticulous operation was unfolding just a few blocks from our home. Jack, the retired cop with a keen eye and a determined spirit, had set his plan into motion. Every taxi ride, every late-night exit from our house, was being logged and observed. Jack's unassuming nature belied a meticulous attention to detail that I would soon come to regret underestimating. By the time I stepped off the plane and into the cool evening air of my hometown, I was still caught between the comfort of routine and the ominous hint of betrayal that Jack's words had planted in my mind. I looked forward to reuniting with Laura, to see the familiar warmth in her eyes, to believe once more that our love was invincible. Little did I know that the next chapter of my life would force me to confront a reality far darker than I could have imagined. The stage was set, the players in motion, and as I drove toward home that night, I couldn't help but feel that every mile was leading me closer to a revelation that would change everything. The comforting illusion of routine was about to be shattered, and I was standing at the edge of a precipice, unaware of the fall that awaited me. Returning home after my business trip, I tried to settle back into my old routines with a cautious optimism. I greeted Laura with a smile at the door and listened as she recounted her day, though something in her tone seemed carefully measured. I didn't press too much on details. My mind was still reeling from Jack's ominous warnings. I couldn't shake the memory of his unwavering voice and the promise that evidence was being gathered. Over the next few days, I found myself revisiting every conversation and every unusual pause in Laura's explanations. I combed through old texts and emails, searching for inconsistencies, but nothing stood out. Laura's stories were smooth and, at first glance, perfectly ordinary. Yet, deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt. I wondered if I was simply the victim of an overactive imagination or, worse, in denial about the growing cracks in our marriage. At the same time, Jack began his quiet investigation. I wasn't sure if I could confront him directly without coming off as paranoid, so I waited for his next call. True to his word, a few days later, my phone rang unexpectedly on a chilly Thursday evening. The line clicked and Jack's voice came through, steady and unhurried. "Mark, I hope you're doing well. I have something to show you," he said. There was no preamble, just a matter-of-fact tone that left little room for debate. "What did you find, Jack?" I asked, trying to sound calm even though my heart was pounding. "I've been keeping an eye on things here. Every night, when Laura leaves, I make sure to record the details, the time, the destination, even the license plates of the vehicles she takes. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I want you to see the pattern for yourself." His words were clinical, reminiscent of someone who'd seen far too many betrayals in his long career on the force. The conversation left me both anxious and curious. The next day, I set aside some time after work to meet Jack at a small coffee shop near my house. I wasn't sure what to expect, if his evidence would confirm my suspicions or if it would be just another baseless claim. When I arrived, Jack was already there, a worn folder in hand that looked almost too ordinary to contain something so consequential. Over a couple of cups of strong black coffee, Jack began to share his findings. "I started tracking her movements last week," he explained quietly. "Every evening around 7:30, Laura would get into a taxi. I noted the numbers on the vehicles. Some nights, she'd go to a restaurant downtown. Other nights, I'd see her near that upscale club on Fifth Avenue. There were even a couple of instances where she headed toward a hotel near the center of the city." His voice remained calm, as if discussing weather patterns rather than personal betrayal. I listened intently, my mind racing as I tried to piece together a narrative that made sense. Have you taken any photos or recorded any video? I asked, trying to keep my tone even. Jack nodded, sliding a small USB drive across the table. There's footage from a security camera near your house that caught a taxi pulling up at unusual hours. I managed to retrieve some clips that confirm the taxi rides. I also have details from a few trusted sources, neighbors who observed her returning home late and looking noticeably different than usual. His eyes, though lined with age, held a glimmer of determination that made it hard to dismiss his claims as mere paranoia. I took the USB drive with trembling fingers, my thoughts a tangled web of disbelief and fear. What do you suggest I do? I asked quietly, aware that my life was now being scrutinized in ways I had never imagined. Before you jump to conclusions, Jack replied, I want you to review the evidence for yourself. It's not my place to tell you what to think. I've seen enough in my years, and I know the signs when something isn't right. I simply want you to have the facts so you can decide your next move. His tone was careful, as if he didn't want to force any action on me, yet every word reinforced the gravity of the situation. After parting ways with Jack, I returned home feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. In the solitude of my study, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. The screen flickered to life as I began to review the footage and documents. At first, everything seemed routine, clips of a quiet suburban street, taxis pulling up in front of our house. But as the timestamps matched the evenings when Laura had claimed to be out with friends or attending charity events, a clear pattern began to emerge. There was consistency in the timing, locations that didn't quite add up, and subtle behaviors that, when pieced together, painted a picture that was hard to ignore. I recalled a particular night that Jack had mentioned, a night when a taxi pulled up unusually close to our home, and the driver had lingered longer than usual. The clip showed Laura stepping out of the car, not with a hurried pace of someone returning home, but with a measured gait, as if she had somewhere specific to be. There was a moment when she paused, glanced over her shoulder, and then continued on her path. It was a small detail, but one that resonated with the hints of secrecy that Jack had described. My hands trembled as I replayed the footage several times, each viewing etching the evidence deeper into my mind. I began to list out the patterns, late departures, the specific routes, the consistent return times that were always later than expected. It wasn't dramatic or overly sensational, it was the slow, creeping revelation of habits that didn't align with the life I thought we shared. That night I barely slept. I lay awake, the images from the recordings running through my head, each detail a building block for a reality I wasn't ready to accept. I felt a growing sense of isolation, trapped between a longing for the life I once believed in and the undeniable evidence staring back at me. I remembered the moment I had laughed off Jack's initial warning, convinced it was nothing more than an old man's fantasy. Now, I was forced to confront the possibility that my trust had been misplaced. As dawn crept in through the curtains, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Laura immediately. Instead, I needed to gather more information, to understand the full extent of what was happening before I acted. I began to draft a careful plan in my mind. I would review the evidence one more time, analyze every detail, and maybe even speak to some of the neighbors who had observed her movements. I owed it to myself to be certain, to know every facet of this unfolding story before deciding the next step. The day ahead was filled with a strange blend of determination and sorrow. I was preparing to face the reality of a betrayal I never thought possible, yet I also felt a surge of resolve to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Jack's quiet diligence had opened a door to a mystery that I could no longer ignore. Even as I wondered about the reasons behind Laura's actions, I focused on the tangible evidence laid out before me. Every moment, every detail, now took on a new weight. The calm suburban streets, the rhythmic sound of passing cars, even the quiet hum of my home. Everything was a reminder that beneath the veneer of everyday life, hidden secrets could unravel with devastating clarity. And as I looked at the evidence one more time, I realized that the shadows creeping into my life were not figments of my imagination but undeniable signs of an impending storm. I closed my laptop with a heavy heart, knowing that the next step in this journey would force me to confront not just Laura, but also the reality of how little I really knew about the life I had built. The days ahead promised to be filled with tension, difficult conversations, and a quest for truth that I was no longer able to postpone. And so, as the morning light grew stronger, I prepared myself to face the truth, one piece of evidence at a time. In the days that followed my confrontation with evidence, I resolved to take a step back and observe rather than act on impulse. I couldn't afford to let my emotions get in the way of clear judgment. I needed more than fleeting hints. I needed a complete picture. With Jack's evidence fresh in my mind and the recorded patterns of Laura's nightly excursions, I decided to quietly monitor the situation while attempting to live a semblance of normalcy. I began by retracing the routes that Jack had noted. Every evening, just as the clock neared 7:30, I found myself scanning the neighborhood with a quiet vigilance. I wasn't a detective by trade, but my life had suddenly taken on the role of an investigator. I set up my old camcorder on the porch, determined to capture any anomaly with my own eyes. There was something methodical about it, a routine of observation that made the long hours more bearable. One cool evening, while I sat in my recliner with a cup of coffee, I noticed a pattern that matched Jack's account. A sleek black sedan pulled up in front of our house, its headlights briefly illuminating the quiet street. I strained to see, but the image on the screen was grainy. The car idled for a moment before a figure emerged, Laura. I watched as she gathered her purse and stepped into a waiting taxi parked at the curb. The taxi's number plate was partially visible, and I managed to catch a few seconds of the driver's face before the car sped off into the darkened avenues. That same night, I made a few discreet phone calls to other neighbors. One, a middle-aged man who preferred to remain anonymous, confirmed that he had seen Laura step into a luxurious car and drive off towards a well-known upscale restaurant downtown. Another neighbor, a young woman who lived across the hall from Jack, mentioned that she often heard the faint hum of taxi engines late at night and occasionally saw a familiar silhouette stepping out of one of them. Their accounts were consistent, adding another layer of credibility to what I had already suspected. Jack continued his silent investigation as well. True to his promise, he reached out again with updates. "Mark," he said in his steady, unhurried tone, "I've got more details that might interest you. Last night, I managed to follow the trail further than before. Laura was seen at a venue on Central Boulevard, a high-end hotel known for discreet meetings." His voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of any sensationalism. "I've collected the time logs, and they all point to a plan pattern. This isn't random, it's orchestrated." Hearing Jack's words, a part of me wanted to dismiss everything as an overblown misunderstanding. But the evidence was accumulating, each piece interlocking with the last to form a narrative I couldn't ignore. That evening, while reviewing the footage and logs on my laptop, I started to see the structure of a well-rehearsed routine. Laura's departures were always timed perfectly to coincide with the beginning of her rendezvous at various upscale locations. The taxi rides weren't merely casual errands, they were a deliberate sequence that suggested something far more organized. It wasn't long before I uncovered details that hinted at regularity. There were nights when she returned alone, and other nights when her return was marked by a slight delay, a delay that, on closer inspection, corresponded with prolonged stays at a hotel's reception area. I recalled Jack mentioning that on a couple of occasions, there were reports of her meeting someone who wasn't part of her usual social circle. The idea wasn't extravagant in itself. Infidelity, however, always carries its own brand of meticulous secrecy. One rainy Wednesday, I decided to test the consistency of the routine. I left home earlier than usual and parked discreetly behind a row of bushes near our driveway. I wanted to see if Laura's departure would happen as reliably as the logs indicated. Sure enough, around 7:30 p.m., I saw her exit the house. She wore a stylish coat and carried her usual handbag, a look I had come to associate with a calm confidence. A black taxi pulled up almost immediately, and she slipped inside with a composed air that made the scene almost mundane. The taxi pulled away, and I managed to glimpse the driver's badge number on the taxi's small display. I quickly noted it down. The routine continued night after night, and with each occurrence, my resolve to understand the complete story grew stronger. I even began to compare notes with Jack, who was ever meticulous in his own records. He told me that he had reached out to a couple of his old contacts from his police days, individuals who could discreetly confirm the high-end nature of the venues Laura frequented. One contact, a security manager at the Central Boulevard Hotel, confirmed that a guest matching Laura's description had been recorded entering the premises several times over the past month. The new information wasn't entirely surprising, but it forced me to accept a stark reality. This was no spontaneous lapse in judgment or an impulsive affair. There was a deliberate pattern, one that had been going on for weeks, if not months. And while I struggled with the rising tide of betrayal, I couldn't help but admire the systematic nature of the operation. Laura was executing her nightly escapades with a precision that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. With every detail, I pieced together a picture of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. There were no wild, unpredictable moments, only a carefully choreographed sequence of departures, meetings, and returns. I found myself documenting every detail in a worn notebook, the pages filled with timestamps, locations, and observations. It was a ledger of betrayal, written in the language of precision and routine. I also began to question the larger implications of this routine. What was the endgame? Was this a fleeting phase, or was there a deeper motive behind these calculated actions? The absence of any dramatic confrontation or overt passion made it all the more puzzling. Laura's actions were devoid of the raw emotion typically associated with infidelity. They were methodical, almost businesslike. It was as if she was compartmentalizing her life into two separate, unconnected routines, one for the home and one for the nights on the town. As I continued to compile the evidence, I realized that I was no longer just an unsuspecting husband returning from a business trip. I had become an amateur sleuth, a silent witness to the unraveling of a marriage that, on the surface, had always seemed solid. The routine was clear, the evidence mounting, and the implications more severe than I could have imagined. One particular evening, after a particularly long day of work and covert observation, I found myself alone in the study with Jack's latest notes spread before me. The numbers, the locations, the consistent patterns, it all pointed to a betrayal that was both premeditated and relentless. The details were meticulously organized, each entry corroborating the next, until the entire picture of a double life was laid out in stark clarity. In that quiet moment, with the soft hum of the night outside, I felt the weight of what was to come. The truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was waiting to be confronted head-on. And as I closed my notebook, I knew that the next phase of this investigation would force me to confront not only Laura but also the reality of the life I thought I knew. The trail was clear, the routine undeniable. My life was about to change in ways I had never foreseen, and I was standing on the precipice of a revelation that would alter everything. In the silence of that moment, I realized that the secrets of the night were about to come to light, and there would be no turning back once the final piece of the puzzle was in place. I returned home on a brisk autumn evening, the evidence of Laura's double life neatly compiled in my notebook and on my laptop. Every timestamp, every detail from Jack's surveillance and my own observations, lay before me as undeniable proof. The air in our house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were waiting for an explanation. I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp contrasting with the cold reality laid out on the coffee table. I reviewed every detail one more time, committing to memory the routine I had documented so meticulously: the taxi rides, the upscale restaurants, the discreet hotel check-ins. This wasn't a moment of sudden, impulsive betrayal. It was a well-orchestrated series of actions that stretched on for weeks, maybe months. There was no dramatic flair, only the steady accumulation of calculated decisions. The confrontation had to be handled like the business deal I'd spent my career mastering: cold, deliberate, and fact-based. I called Laura to the study. Her expression was guarded as she stepped into the room, her eyes reflecting surprise and a hint of defiance. I placed my notebook on the table and looked at her steadily. "Laura, I've been gathering information," I began, my tone even. "I have proof of your routine, the taxi rides, the places you've been going. I have everything here." There was a long pause. She searched my face, her own eyes briefly betraying the calm effort that she usually maintained. "Mark, you're saying that I've been lying to you all this time?" she finally asked, her voice measured. I'm simply saying that the evidence doesn't lie, I replied. I slid the USB drive toward her, the one that Jack had given me, the silent confirmation of my doubts. I've seen the footage, the records. I'd rather not believe that everything we built was a lie. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence was punctuated only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Laura's hands trembled as she reached for the drive, and her eyes briefly met mine. I could see that she was processing not only the evidence but the reality of the situation, as clear and uncompromising as the facts in front of us. Finally, she exhaled slowly. I didn't expect you to confront me like this, Mark. Her voice trailed off, and for a moment I wondered if she'd never find the words to explain herself. I'm not here to punish or to lecture you, I said calmly. I need to know what this is about. You've been leading a double life, and I deserve to understand why. My voice was steady, devoid of bitterness. It was the tone of a man who had spent weeks assembling undeniable evidence, and who now demanded nothing less than the truth. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly, and she shifted her weight as if preparing for a long, difficult conversation. It started when you began traveling more, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. I found myself alone more often than not. I didn't ask for this, Mark. It wasn't planned like a script, it just happened. Her words were curt, lacking the emotional overflow I had expected. Instead of a torrent of apologies or dramatic declarations, there was a measured explanation that felt almost transactional. Who is it? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. She hesitated for a moment. It wasn't just one person. It was a series of encounters. Each time, it felt like the moment was right, like I was reclaiming something I'd lost in our routine. Her eyes dropped to the table, and I could see a glimmer of regret mingled with resolve. Reclaiming what? I pressed. She looked up, meeting my gaze with a steady, unyielding look. I can't put it into words. It wasn't about love or passion. It was about feeling alive when everything else felt controlled and predictable. There was no dramatic flourish in her voice, just a blunt confession that left little room for emotional justification. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes as if echoing the tension inside the room. I had expected a confession with remorse or a justification filled with emotion, but instead I was met with clinical clarity. So it was all calculated? I asked, almost to myself. It was more like, I allowed myself to be led by circumstances, she replied. I wasn't planning a grand affair, I was simply reacting to the loneliness and the routine that had become unbearable. Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost as if she were describing the weather rather than the unraveling of our life together. I stared at her, absorbing her words. The meticulously documented evidence lay between us, a silent witness to nights spent chasing an elusive freedom, a freedom that was, for her, more tangible than the promises of a marriage I thought was built on trust. In that moment, the intrigue that had been so carefully built over weeks revealed itself in its raw form. A calculated departure from the life we'd known, without the drama or the theatrics of a typical betrayal. The room remained silent for a long while. I had two choices now, to let the evidence and her words tear us apart immediately, or to try and understand the routine behind the betrayal and decide what to do next. I need time, I finally said, not as a concession or a compromise, but as a necessity. I need to think about this, about us and what comes next. Laura nodded, her face expressionless. Take all the time you need, Mark, she replied quietly. In the following days I sifted through the evidence again. I retraced every moment, every taxi ride, every restaurant visit and hotel check-in. I talked with Jack once more, not out of anger but out of a need to understand the operational details of her routine. He confirmed what I already knew and added that, from his perspective, Laura had always been careful, too careful. There was no hint of spontaneity, no drunken escapades or impulsive decisions. It was all a systematic breakdown of routine into a series of calculated actions. As I delved deeper into the facts, I began to see the betrayal not as a shocking revelation but as the unveiling of a life that had been quietly slipping away. My world, which I had built on certainty and order, was now marked by discrepancies, Details that spoke of nights spent in pursuit of something that our marriage could no longer provide. The evidence had forced me to confront a truth that was neither melodramatic nor cathartic, but plain and unyielding. I arranged one final meeting with Laura. We sat together at our kitchen table, a neutral ground where countless mundane conversations had once taken place. "I've thought about everything," I said slowly. "I know what you needed, and I can't say I completely understand it. But I can't ignore the fact that you chose this routine over our marriage." She looked at me, her expression composed. "I know," she said simply. "I've lived two separate lives for too long, and I lost sight of what we had." Her words were devoid of tears or anger, only a straightforward admission that left little room for negotiation. In that quiet moment, I realized that the truth wasn't in the grand gestures or the dramatic confrontations, it was in the cold, precise details of everyday actions. The routine of betrayal was not a fleeting lapse, but a consistent departure from a shared life that had grown predictable. We both knew that nothing could be fixed with apologies or half measures. The decision we made that night was not born out of vengeance or overwhelming sorrow, but from the undeniable clarity of the facts. We agreed to separate, to part ways with the knowledge of what had transpired and the understanding that our lives, once intertwined, were now irreversibly divided. There were no dramatic final words or tearful embraces, just a mutual recognition that the time had come to move on. As I drove away that night, leaving behind the house that held the remnants of our shared past, I couldn't help but reflect on how life had unfolded with all its meticulous details. The evidence, the routine, and the steady accumulation of truths had led to this final reckoning. A life carefully dissected by the mundane details of betrayal. This was the end of one chapter, a cold and deliberate conclusion to a story that began with routine and ended with undeniable proof. And while I would carry the memory of every carefully documented moment with me, I also knew that the future would now be built on new beginnings, free from the shadow of routine and betrayal. And I had just stepped into a game that was much, much bigger than I ever realized. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.